Today we're going to hear a talk about justice. Today's speaker is Gabby Valentine. She serves as the Bonner Scholars Coordinator here at Carson-Newman. She works with a cohort of over 40 students doing 140 hours of intentional service in and around Jefferson City every semester. Gabby graduated from Sewanee, the University of the South, in 2017 with a degree in American Studies. While in college, she was a Bonner leader who served at a local area food bank to bring hospitality, love, and food security to the greater Sewanee community. Before coming to Carson-Newman, Gabby spent a year working for the Niswonger Foundation as a college access advisor for 3 Sullivan County public high schools. She has a passion for helping students develop the skills they need to tackle the issues they care about in our community, country, and the world. Please help me in welcoming Gabby.
So today we are going to be talking about privilege. What you need to know about what I do, my job isn't just making sure that students do community service. We meet every week and we talk about social justice issues. We meet every week and we talk about personal issues. We talk about our identities. We talk about our experiences in the world. And so I'm trying to bring a little bit of what we do every week at our Bonner meetings to you, to y'all who are sitting here. So hopefully this will be an interactive Eagle Talk. We're going to have some opportunities for some live polling. Y'all will get to be on your phones as a part of the actual. So today we're going to be talking about privilege, but we're going to be talking about it on a social scale. If I asked you right now, how do you define yourself? It might look like a lot of different things. I did this presentation with some students in high school a couple days ago, and some of the answers they gave me were that they identified themselves as curious, exhausted, because it was November and finals are coming. They identified themselves as hardworking. They identified themselves as funny, as active, as timid, as shy. Those are your personal identities. That's how you define yourself, right? And how you define yourself matters, and it's the thing that you have control over. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to be talking about your social identity. Your social identity means a lot of different things. Some of those identities are things you can change. Some of those identities are things you can't change. Some of those identities are physical, the way you look, the clothes you can afford. Some of those identities are personal, the faith you believe in. Either way, those social identities come with communities, right? You're in a community, whether you feel like it or not, based on what you believe. You're in a community of people who might look like you. You're in a community of people who might be in the same tax bracket as you. And that's the kind of identity we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is get out your phones, and you're going to go to this, on your web browser, you're going to go to this link, okay? You're not going to do anything with this link yet. We're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to do some live polling, so it should be a little bit interactive. Hopefully you guys can take something from this for yourself. I'm going to be asking you a lot today to do some self-inventory, to think about where you stand in a lot of this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that. And then if I could just have a thumbs up when people feel like they've gotten there. I'm getting a few, not a whole lot. Cool. Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit more time, and as I do that, I'm going to introduce this idea that we're going to talk about next. This next idea we're going to talk about is understanding your identities. So when we move to the next slide, we're going to be talking about different kind of identity clusters that you might fall into. And I've given Webster definitions for all of those. And what I want you to do when we get to this is think about where you stand. For every single one of these big circles, I want you to think about an identity for you. You don't have to tell me. You don't have to tell anybody. This isn't for you to project it to the world. This is for you to understand it for yourself. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a little bit of these definitions. I got all of these definitions off of Webster's dictionary. So it's important, though, when we're talking about something like this, something that can be sometimes hard and difficult, that we're all on the same page of definitions. There's a ton of different ways we could describe all of these words. But it's important that for this exercise, we utilize the same language so that we understand what we're talking about. So when we're talking about race as an identity, we're talking about a category of humankind that shares a certain distinctive physical traits. There's some different ways you could describe race. That's the one we're going to use because it was off the dictionary and it's pretty easy to understand. That means people who tend to look like you, right? Your race might be that you're white. It might be that you're black. It might be that you're Latinx. So that's what we're talking about really when we're talking about race. Next, we're going to talk about class. Class is a group sharing the same economic or social status, right? So when we talk about class, what we're really talking about is kind of those tax brackets, or are you low income? Did your family grow up below the poverty line? Are you working class? Did your family make just enough to get by? Is your family middle class? You could take some vacations once a year and you were comfortable. Are you upper middle class? Are you upper class? On and on and on and so forth until you get to, the Kardashians and their wealth. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about class, is what is the level to which you, and because most of you are freshmen and probably have some financial connection to your family still. We're talking about your families too. What kind of family structure did you grow up in related to wealth? We're also going to think about gender. We're describing that as behavioral, cultural, or physiological traits typically associated with one's sex. So that means, are you male? Are you female? How does that translate into how you walk the world, the things that you are told you can and can't do, should or shouldn't do? When we're thinking about identity, we're also thinking about sexual orientation, a person's sexual identity or self-identification. We're also talking about nationality. This is something that sometimes people get confused with race a lot of times, and it's important to separate those two things. So nationality is a legal relationship involving allegiance on the part of an individual and usually protection on the part of the state. That's a really weird way to say you have a passport or an ID from a certain country. That's what that means when we're talking about that. So your nationality has a lot to do with where you legally identify, right? Your identity might also be your faith affiliation, the belief in the traditional doctrines of a religion. So when we talk about faith affiliation, and when we're talking about it in this context of identity and in privilege, we're not talking about your personal theology, because I'm sure we have a ton of diversity of how we really think about the way that we believe, the way that we walk in our beliefs. We're talking about a lot of the cultural things that come around that, right, with your faith affiliation. If you are of a certain faith, that means you expect to celebrate certain holidays. That means that there's probably a certain way that maybe you were taught to dress. There are certain traditions that you follow, maybe certain rituals, certain things you do on certain days of the week. Do you go to church on Sunday? Do you go to church on Saturday? Do you take Christmas off, or do you take Hanukkah off? That's what we're really talking about when we talk about faith affiliation. And then we're also this is one I added personally because I really care about it as an American Studies major and as an Appalachian person, is regionality. It's not something we think about a lot. It's not something we talk about a lot, but it's something that's important and that can come with privileges and disadvantages. When we're thinking about regionality, we're thinking about a broad geographic area distinguished by similar features. So we can think about that on a large scale. We can think about that as we live in Appalachia right now. Because you are sitting in this church in Jefferson City, Tennessee, you are in Appalachia. Appalachia is a region that has its own identities, it has its own stereotypes, it has its own issues and positives. But we can also think about it on maybe a more abstract lens. Did you grow up in the city? Did you grow up in the country? Did you grow up in the suburbs? Those things matter when we're thinking about our identity and the way that we interact with others too, right? So when we're thinking about region, we're either thinking about, am I from Appalachia? Am I from the Deep South? Am I from the North? Am I from the West? Am I from the Midwest? But we're also thinking about, did I grow up in East and North Knoxville? Did I grow up in West Knoxville? Did I grow up in rural Jefferson City or Jefferson County? Regionality can matter a lot to our identities, whether we think about it every day or not. And we're also talking about ability. This is one that we don't always talk about too, right? So the definition from the dictionary says that it's the quality or state of being able, especially physical, mental, or legal power to something. We're really going to focus on that physical and mental power to do something today. So when we're talking about ability, we're talking about maybe some of the things you can control, right? How fast can you run? How fast can you walk? But we're talking about some of those things you can't control too. Do you wear glasses? Do you have to use a wheelchair? Do you have to use crutches? Do you have to have accommodations when you take a test? Those kinds of things are what we're going to be talking about when we think about your identity as an ability. So, with that, I'm going to ask y'all to get those phones back out if you have pulled up that URL, and we're going to do some polls. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to think about the identity that is most prevalent in your life. Of all the things we just talked about, of all the things we just defined, what is the one that matters most to you? And we should be having a link to a poll pulling up here soon. If not, you should still be able to see it on your phones themselves. Awesome. Okay. The numbers are coming in. We've already got 160 plus people adding to this poll, which is really cool. So when you're thinking about this, again, if you haven't already answered, we're thinking about those identities that you think about the most, the ones that you are constantly kind of aware of. All right. So it's looking like there are some clear winners here. The thing that it seems like most of y'all are thinking about the most is faith affiliation, which makes sense. We're at Carson-Newman University. This is a Christian university. Our faith should be important to us here, right? That should be something we think about. But I'm going to give you two other reasons this might be what you think about the most. One might be that this is something you have control over. You can control your faith identity. You can control what church you go to some degree. I mean, maybe more now that you're in college than when you were at home and had to go wherever your family went. You can control how you believe. You can control how your faith affects your life. But also, this might be one that you feel vulnerable in. You might think about this identity the most, and maybe this is more true for the people who think more about their ability or race. Maybe you have to think about this identity so much because it's the one that opens you up to the most negative attention or the most vulnerability, right? I'm a woman of color. I sometimes get nervous about how people are going to perceive me because I am not a white woman, right? So I am constantly thinking about how am I going to be perceived by other people? What are the ways that other people are going to stereotype me based on that identity? So maybe that's a reason that these identities matter and you're thinking about them constantly because you have to mitigate these roles together. All right, now I'm going to ask y'all to think about the identity that matters least in your personal life or that you think about the least in your personal life. Okay. Polls are coming in hot. This one's a little more, there's a little bit more variation in the answers. That's really cool to see. So I know there's at least 200 of you participating, so I'm going to wait till we get to that number. But it's looking like race and sexual orientation, nationality, regionality, those are the things we're not thinking about as much as maybe we're thinking about our faith affiliation or we're thinking about our ability. And that's really interesting. So I'm going to give you two reasons why that might be. So one reason might be you have a pretty good community around you, and you don't really have to think about that very much because you're around people who support you in whatever it is, however you are. Another reason, this might be the thing you think about the least, is because this is where you have the most privilege. You might not have to think about your race because maybe you're in a room where most of the people look like you, and so you don't have to worry about it that much. Maybe you don't have to think about your race or your sexual orientation because you're used to seeing media representations of you. You're used to being the norm, right? And that's important to think about. Sometimes we don't think about our identities because we don't have to, because there's power in that, there's privilege in that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And my goal today, and I'm going to tell you this now, is not to make you feel guilty. My goal today is to make you aware and then give you tools to move forward with that self-awareness. But it's important to think about maybe why you don't have to think about your race or your sexual orientation. And likely that's because there's a privilege that comes with that. So what are we defining as privilege? I'll tell you what Webster says, and then I'll tell you what Bonner says. And we'll move back to the PowerPoint. So privilege, according to the Webster Dictionary, is a noun, a right or immunity granted as a particular benefit, advantage, or favor. Okay? But we also define it in kind of the social justice world as socially granted, maybe unearned, advantages accorded to some people and not others. And this might be connected to cultural, social, and structural forms of bias, right? So when we're thinking about privilege, when we're thinking about our identities, in a perfect world, we could be any identity in the world and it would not matter. It would not affect what happens to us when we go to the courthouse. It would not affect what happens when we get pulled over by the police. It would not affect how we're treated at a store or by other people in the world. In a perfect world, none of that would matter. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where policies have been created based on biases, based on xenophobia, based on fear, based on an attempt to other people. And so it's important to know that, because in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to talk about this. But we are, and we do, and we should, because hopefully by talking about this and talking about privilege, we're going to be able to bring some light and some equality to the world when we leave this room. So we're going to play a game. Get your phone back out. And it's kind of like Never Have I Ever, if you've ever played that. You don't have to admit to me if you have. But it's called You Might Be Privileged If. And I'm going to read some prompts based on these identities that we've already discussed. And I want you to keep track in your head first, and then we'll use the poll. But I'm going to keep track in your head of maybe, or on your hands, or on your toes, or whatever, of which of these prompts I'm going to read apply to you, and which of them maybe don't. Okay? So, let's dig in. You might be privileged if you can go shopping alone, and most of the time, you're pretty well assured that you will not be followed or harassed by employees. You might be privileged if you are never asked to speak for all of the people of your race. You might be privileged if you can be late to a meeting without having that lateness reflect on your race. You might be privileged if you do not fear that you or your family are going to be hungry or homeless. And we're going to narrow that to a time frame, that maybe you might be privileged if within the month you're not afraid that in the next month your family might be hungry or homeless. You might be privileged if you could probably advance your career by pulling strings or asking a favor of a friend or family member. You might be privileged if the choice between going immediately to college and going immediately to work was an easy choice. You might be privileged if you have a bad day or in a bad mood and people aren't going to blame it on your gender. You might be privileged if you can walk down the street without fear of sexual harassment. You might be privileged if your ability to marry who you want is completely protected by our laws. You might be privileged if you do not have to worry about physical or mental harassment and assault when holding hands with your partner. You might be privileged if you are pulled over and your immigration status is not automatically assumed or questioned. You might be privileged if, because you have a U.S. passport, you are able to travel to most countries with relative ease. You might be privileged if you can expect to have time off to worship and celebrate your religious holidays. So you might be privileged if the school calendar matches your faith affiliation calendar. You might be privileged if politicians can make decisions citing your faith without being labeled as extremists. You might be privileged if disclosing your faith on an adoption form will not likely prevent you from being able to adopt. You might be privileged if your accent is not mocked or assumed to represent ignorance. You might be privileged if you lived in a city or town with a lot of community resources. You had easily accessible public transportation. You might be privileged if you didn't have to think about which door you would use to enter this building. You might be privileged if you don't have to worry about how you're going to get to the second floor of a multi-level building. You might be privileged if you were able to read just about anything in a bookstore without the use of Braille or large font or an audio reader. And you might be privileged if your ability to get married does not put you at risk of losing your disability benefits. All right. So hopefully you kept a tally in your head of how many of those related to you and maybe how many of them didn't. And now I want you to ask on this poll, how many could you check off? How many of those things that I just read could you say, I don't have to worry about those things? And we'll see what that shows on the poll. Okay. Cool. First, I want to say thank you for being honest and open about this. I'm not going to ask any of you. I'm not going to point to you and be like, hey, which ones did you say yes or no to? But I think it's really important for you to be aware of these things. And I think it's pretty fair to say most of us in this room live a pretty privileged life. We're in college. Well, y'all are. I'm not. I'm done with that. But you're in college. You're getting an education at a private institution. That's pretty privileged. Not in a bad way. Maybe you're the first in your family to be doing this. That's pretty cool. But yeah, for the most part, we're all pretty privileged. And some of that we can't control. Some of that we had no power over. So, my next question is, are you feeling guilty yet? Are you feeling maybe a little bit bitter? Are you feeling bad, icky? There's a weird muck in your stomach of like, well, why is she bringing this up? I don't control what my parents make. I don't control what my parents don't make. I don't control what race I was born. So why does it matter? And the real reason it matters is because we want to move past maybe that guilt from that 80% of us who have 10 and above of those privilege markers. We want to move past that guilt, that ickiness, that feel badness, or maybe that defensiveness, like, well, maybe I worked hard. Maybe my parents worked really hard for that money, and it's not my fault that they were able to buy me a car at 16, which is true. My parents were able to buy me a car at 16. That's a privilege. There's a defensiveness, too, that might come with that. But the goal is not to sit in those feelings. The goal is not to feel bad about those feelings. The goal is to move past that guilt and move to justice. We want to use that self-awareness that hopefully y'all have just encountered. And we're going to see some ways in which you might be able to use that privilege to leverage it for justice for others. Because a lot of these privileges are things that everybody deserves, right? Everybody deserves a home that they're comfortable in. Everybody deserves to be able to walk down the street safely. Everybody deserves to be judged on their merit, not by the way that they look or the race that they are, right? Like, y'all can nod if you agree. If you completely disagree with me, that's fine. You can shake your head too. But there are certain things that maybe everybody deserves, that maybe not everybody is getting. And so our goal is to use the privilege that we have as college-educated citizens to move that needle of justice just a little bit further. So I'm going to give you some examples of ways that you might be able to leverage your privilege, or ways that others have already leveraged their privilege to make the world a little bit better. So, our first example is going to be, have any of y'all watched The Good Place? Yeah, maybe? No? Have any of y'all all watched Gracie and Frankie on Netflix? 9 to 5 with Dolly Parton in it? Our first example is going to be Jane Fonda and Ted Danson. So in the month of October, Jane Fonda got arrested 3 times in Washington, D.C. Now, Jane Fonda has won multiple Academy Awards, multiple film awards, as has Ted Danson. They make good money. They have enough money to be arrested, hire a lawyer, pay bail, and they work in a field where if they get arrested, they're not going to probably lose their job, right? Like, we know there are lots of celebrities who get arrested for lots of different things and continue to be in that show or continue to be in that movie that they're in. So they have privilege based on their wealth and their careers that allow them to step in front of those people who maybe don't have those privileges. If y'all got arrested today for protesting, would you be able to afford a lawyer and bail? Probably not, because I couldn't, and I have a full-time salaried position. So these two have used their privilege and their fame to keep others safe, so that other people, maybe the college students who are protesting with them, maybe the individuals who can't afford bail, are not the ones actually going into those situations. Let's move on to another example of people using their privilege. So in 2011, there was a revolution in Egypt, and it was a very interfaith, interclass revolution. And the protesters knew that at the time that was called for Muslim people to go and pray, the police might use that as an opportunity to attack or arrest those people. So the Christians that were protesting, along with their Muslim brothers and sisters, created a barrier in front of them. They used their privilege to say, I know that I'm not going to get arrested because I don't have to pray at a certain time the same way you do, so I'm going to keep you safe. In 2018, when there was a synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that next day, a lot of Jewish people wanted to go to their temple in Canada, but were scared. So the Muslim community there created a human ring of peace in order to protect them so that they could go and worship in their place of holiness. In 2019, there was a shooting in New Zealand, and a lot of people died in a mosque. Now, that shooter used white supremacist symbolism on his gun. Some of that symbolism is the same symbolism that was used about 7 miles from here when the Highlander Research Center was caught on fire by white nationalists. So this wasn't just an attack of a mean person, this was pointed and targeted on a specific population. So hundreds of people in Christchurch, New Zealand, came together and created a circle around that mosque using their privilege to protect people as they prayed. Let's move on to a couple other examples. So this top video, we're not going to play it, mostly because it's a screenshot, so it wouldn't work, is of an author. Her name is Joy DeGruy. She's also an educator. She is black. And she has a sister-in-law who's mixed, who looks a lot like me. They were at the grocery store, and that's what this story talks about is. They were at the grocery store. This author went first in the line and was treated poorly by the cashier, just terribly. And then her sister-in-law goes to pay for her groceries, lighter skin, looser hair, blue eyes, and is treated totally different. Treated with kindness, yes ma'am, no ma'am. And that sister-in-law noticed that difference. And that sister-in-law, knowing that she had privilege in that space, said something and said, "You didn't treat my sister that way. Why are you treating me differently than you treated my sister?" She used her privilege to speak out and acknowledge a biases that had been created in that tiny instance. I'm sure you guys have seen in the news recently about the Stanford sex assault issues bubbling back up. Right now we know the name of the woman. She's come forward. Her name is Chanel Miller. And so this article comes from her meeting the 2 men that stopped Brock Turner from raping her. Those two boys, late at night, could have kept walking. It's not their job to stop that. They don't need to do that. But they were the same size as him. They knew that they would probably be safer than she would be, so they used their privilege to stop another person from harming this girl. So these are just some examples, some large, dramatic examples of how you might be able to use your privilege every day. I'm not saying you should go get arrested. Please don't. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that there are different degrees to which we can use our privilege and put ourselves in the ways of people who might be more marginalized, who might have more to risk by speaking up. So here are some easy ways you might be able to leverage your privilege and create a just society. Some ways that maybe won't put you right in the line of danger, like those two Swedish people were when they confronted Brock Turner. So one of those ways is to listen. And not just to listen, but to believe. Lots of people have lots of different experiences. And when somebody is speaking to you and telling you that their experience is really hard, it's very easy to get defensive and say, well, my life is hard too. Well, you're saying that you had to deal with this. Well, maybe I had to deal with it too. But maybe they're not telling you that experience in order to make you feel bad. Maybe they just need somebody to listen and believe that they're going through something hard. And maybe that something hard is more abstract. Maybe it's a larger issue than just one person dealing with a hard situation. Also, educate yourself about the struggles of others. I just told y'all I'm a woman of color. I'm okay talking about that. I would be glad to talk to any of you if you have questions about my experience, and maybe get you in contact with people who would love to tell their experience to you. But it is not the job of people in vulnerable situations to tell you how to not be racist, how to not be sexist, how to not be hurtful. That's not their job. That's emotional labor, and they're not getting paid to do that. So sometimes that means you have to educate yourself. So you have Google. I know a lot of you have smartphones because you've already used them. So if there are things you don't know about, Google them. Something that I've learned recently is I have a really big privilege blind spot when it comes to indigenous people and indigenous rights. I don't really know a lot about Native American history. I focused a lot on Harlem Renaissance and Reconstruction era history when I was in college, so I really don't know a lot about Native struggles. And because I know that, I was like, all right, I'm a big Instagram user. I'm going to go follow some Native American artists, some Native American activists on Instagram. And because of that, I'm now at least a little bit more aware of what's going on in their lives. So it's as easy as following people maybe that don't look like you, maybe that don't think like you, maybe that don't believe like you, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, so that you can follow along as they're talking about their experiences and learn something in the process. Another way that you might be able to leverage your privilege is to speak up when you see others being treated differently or poorly from you. Sometimes it's hard because we feel like it's not our place to step in when something's going on. But if you are in a store and you see someone being treated poorly, how much does it really harm you to step up and say, that's not okay? Probably not at all. The cashier's not going to come and body slam you onto the ground, unless you're at a wrestling store, in which case that comes with its own can of worms. It's you speaking up, if you know that you're coming from a place of more privilege, puts you at far less risk than if that person that's being treated poorly spoke up for themselves. And they might not be listened to as well as you are. And finally, a thing you can do that's really important, especially in places like Carson-Newman, where maybe people of these vulnerable populations aren't in the room, is to speak up in your own communities. That looks like a lot of things. If you're in a group and it's just you and the boys, right, hanging out playing video games, and one of your dudes says something that's really offensive about women, don't laugh. That's not cool, man. Hey, we're not going to do that, because they're going to respect you maybe more than those people they're joking about. If you're in a group of friends, you're in the dining hall, and somebody walks forward and they have a physical disability, and somebody starts making fun of them. Hey man, we're not gonna do that. Hey girl, we're not gonna do that. That's not cool. We don't joke like that. Those things seem really minimal, and they seem kind of scary, right? Like confrontation is really scary. You don't want to tell your friends that you don't think they're funny, or you don't want to tell your partner you don't think they're funny. But those moments matter. I remember I made a really insensitive joke once in my biology class in high school. My biology teacher looked me dead in the eye and said, "We're not joking like that. That's not cool." And I still remember that, which is why I'm saying it out loud, and that was in high school. That moment taught me that I couldn't joke in insensitive ways because there were going to be people who held me accountable and held me to a higher standard. So even if there's not someone in the room of those marginalized or vulnerable populations that we've talked about, those identities that may be less privileged, you still have the power to help, you still have the power to protect, and you have the power to educate, even in your own communities. All right, so I'm going to leave you with this last thing, this last verse. And you might not be able to see it, but it says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others." When we begin to think beyond ourselves, when we act on the interests of the entirety of our community, whether that be local or global, we are one step closer to getting peace and justice.